Welcome. I have the great pleasure to introduce Peter Bridgewater to today's talk on rewilding the body and rewilding the mind. Peter is an adjunct professor at the University of Canberra, and he refused deeply, because he's so modest, to tell me something about his bio. So I have to read a little bit here to make that obvious what great achievements Peter has done through his career. That's very small.
I hope that's the text.
Yeah. Basically, he's a non-executive chair of the UK Joint Nature Conservation Committee.
No,
He was. He was? Oh, no. Your website is not up to date. He's the Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention. Is it still true?
He was.
He was. And Secretary UNESCO Man and the UNESCO Man and the Biosphere program. He has also a lot of other achievements, awards. Honors include, for example, the jointly chair of the Uluru-Kata-Tjuta National Park Board of Management for excellence in managing a World Heritage Cultural Landscape, and Doctor of Resources of Management, University of New England. I think I stopped there because maybe I use my own words to say that I think Peter is a great asset for the IAE and has been basically the one stop-go man when you want to know something about what's going on in the world about biodiversity conservation issues, and he's the one who you have to talk to. And it's a great pleasure to hand over to Peter. For the guys at the screens, please mute yourself, and if you have questions at the end, please use the chat, and there will be hopefully time to answer your question. I'll translate which one is this presentation. No? Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Good enough or lower?
It'll get better.
I think that's it. Thanks again, and over to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you for I think the last bit. I like the last bit. The former bit doesn't matter. Yama, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we're on Ngunnawal land, and the landscapes that you see are have been shaped by the Ngunnawal people for millennia. And it's something we need to bear in mind all the time. Some of you will know that I was trapped by virtue of a virus in the United Kingdom for about 20 months. And during that time, I managed to get an association with another university, Sheffield Hallam University, which surprisingly is in the city of Sheffield. And they have a very interesting set of ideas. It's a bit like University of Canberra in many ways in attitude, but they have something called the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre. And some of that's about body movement and so on, a bit like our sporty area here. But also they're particularly interested in mental issues, mental health, which of course is a big discussion. And during my time there, I was asked to present to a conference that had been organized called Rewilding the Body, Rewilding the Mind. And I said, yes, I will do that, but I don't think the title is right. And the title was chosen because rewilding is a big thing in the UK at the moment. They've managed to reintroduce the beaver after hunting them to extinction about 400 years ago. And that's relatively successful. But now it's beginning to gain momentum with bringing back the lynx. There really aren't any lynx that are linked, sorry about that, linked to the previous population. The closest are in the Pyrenees, which is mountains between Spain and France. So there are a lot of potential problems as well as perhaps potential advantages with the idea of rewilding. On the other hand, wilding, which is allowing nature to take back a bit of control, is a different issue. And that's one of the things that I'll try and explore this morning. But before I do, just to give a context, in the British Ecological Society's occasional bulletin called The Niche, last winter's edition had the following. According to a study published in 2018, graduate students are more than 6 times as likely to experience depression and anxiety as compared to the general population. So I hope you're now feeling relaxed and comfortable with that. But I think we all understand that that's a real situation and a real case. In the US, a poll focused on the effects of pandemic showed that over 1,000 faculty members, 70% said they felt stressed in 2020, a number that's double that of 2019. In Europe, the figure is quite similar, and I suspect it would be similar here if we did a similar exercise. So there are special features, I think, in academia that give us that kind of levels of anxiety, but it's everywhere. And you can see the news, you talk to your neighbors, you talk to your friends who are not in academia, you will get the same kind of vibes. And now we have, of course, the condition that's called eco-anxiety, which is becoming, unfortunately, particularly common among young people, concerning the effects of climate change, biodiversity loss as it's painted, and so on and so forth. So one way of thinking about this is perhaps a cure for all of this is eco-well-being. How do we get eco-well-being? It's about values and understanding the values that we have with respect to nature. I'm going to use the word nature rather than biodiversity. They're not exactly interchangeable, but they're tending to be used in a kind of interchangeable way. And there are 3 different kinds or classes of values, if you like. Intrinsic, which is basically we understand that nature, biodiversity, if you like, has a right to exist in its own right. That's easy to say, it's much less easy to practice, but that's intrinsic. Then there's instrumental, which unfortunately are the set of values that we as one species have imposed on the rest of biodiversity, which is what is the value of that species? Can I use it? Can I harvest it? Can I eat it? Can I sell it? Can I knock it down and build some nice creation? And those 2 have been around for quite some time, intention. But then there's a new set of values on the block. Since about 2016, these have been discussed more and more. They're called relational values. And it's about the relationship that we have as individuals, and maybe as a group, with nature. And so in my opening remark about the Ngunnawal people, the Ngunnawal land, they have very strong relational values with nature, stronger, in fact, than non-Indigenous people living in this country. And there are a whole set of other different kinds of values. So just bear in mind those 3 classes of values, if you like. And so it boils down, what do we think of nature? Given that one of the most significant challenges is that people will view their relationship with nature in very different ways. And nowhere is this sharper than the use of the term wilderness, which people like to throw around. But wilderness is not something that's actually in space. Wilderness is in there, in people's minds. So my wilderness is very different from Ben's, Ross's, Alejandro's, all of yours. We all have individual ideas of what wilderness is. And it's quite insulting when we talk to Aboriginal people about wilderness because they get very fired up. I remember at one stage when I was involved in Kakadu National Park, an Aboriginal traditional owner said to me, I don't know what you're talking about with wilderness. There's where you say there's wilderness, there's art sites we haven't told you about. There's burial sites, there's axe heads. And by the way, I think wilderness is the Sydney CBD. And so that gives you the kind of idea that we've got different views, we've got different thoughts about things. But by making the relationships clear, there's a significant opportunity we have to improve the way we work, we think and play and talk about nature. And as a group of people that are involved in understanding, developing a deeper understanding of nature and the relationships that species have with each other, that species have with ecosystems and so on, I think we have particular responsibilities for this. So if we have an appropriate informed understanding of what well-being is, and that's not necessarily the same as not being sick, by the way. Well-being is something a little bit more rounded. It's more likely to ensure effective and equitable targeting of spending of public money and informed policymaking. Wouldn't we like informed policymaking, leading to decisions that don't impact on, but neither underestimate the contribution of nature to our economy, our culture, and the wider society. And I list them in that order, but they can be in any particular order. And perhaps it's better to start with culture, because if we get the relationship with culture right, most of the other things then start fit. So there's a few slides I'm going to do now, which might be subheaded birds behaving badly. You'll see why in a moment, but it's in this theme of what we think of nature. This was a promotional series of pictures promoting a particular pub in Yorkshire, talking about come and enjoy the natural surrounds in our backyard. And the natural surround turns out to be a peacock who's enjoying, as you can see in the left-hand side, my left-hand side, the probably badly cooked fish and chips, and then having a very big display for the tourists on the other hand. And what you can see behind that kind of half dead stuff, there's nothing there that's actually native. And that's quite an interesting idea. But those people and the people that are being targeted in this advertisement, for them, it's green, it's nature. What are you arguing about? And there's a bird. How can it not be? Bring you back to this country. Since I've been back, I've come across the following. Here's some lorikeets that landed on the table I was sitting at in a coffee shop quite close to the Sydney Opera House. And as in all cafes, there's a little tumbler with sugar and sweetener, both equally poisonous, but nonetheless, they're there. These lorikeets land and they select deliberately and obviously the sugar, break into it, and then have a right old feast. Then in the middle, you've got the inevitable Sydney bin chicken, this one with particularly poor taste because it's into a Subway wrapper. And then on the far right, I describe this as chilled pigeons on AstroTurf. This is in Melbourne, just to balance Sydney-Melbourne issue. On a nice warm Melbourne afternoon, they're just basking on the AstroTurf while there's some pop music playing. Is this nature? Have we messed about with it? Or is it not? And this one, well, this is it's Friday, so you need some amusement. I came across this, and we all know what gulls are like, but this is a special guy. It's not chips, it's Oreos. It's transatlantic. Oh. Yeah, well, you get the idea. It reminds me of a character I knew when I was spending some time in the Northern Territory, lived outside of Katherine. And he had a pet brolga, which is one of the native birds, very tall native bird, that used to ride into Katherine with him in the front of his ute, accompany him into the supermarket and wander around the supermarket with him like a dog, except the dogs are forbidden, but brolgas aren't, so it was okay. I wanted to show a video from Noosa Biosphere Reserve in Southeast Queensland, but it was very complicated because it was on YouTube. I couldn't get it to particularly work. And anyway, you get all those ghastly advertisements before the thing starts. So I just selected out the particular bit that I wanted to make reference to. And in it, it interviews a number of different people, and it's about a tree planting thing. Everything is now focused on tree planting. This guy, Kerry Jones, Cabby man, and he says, being reconnected with country makes you strong. You can really connect with country and be a part of country. It's like medicine. So keep those words in mind. It's another view of nature. If we look at the issue of environmental quality, which is one of the things that the conference was looking at, it's a general term, and environmental quality can refer to a whole range of different things like how pure is the air? How good is the water? Is there too much pollution? What about noise? Is there access to open space? What are the visual effects that buildings give? And what are the potential effects that all those characteristics combined can have on physical and mental health? If, as Canberra evolves to a city of dense inner city apartments, even though they're not in the inner city, is that going to change the way people feel about Canberra? You've actually got two Canberras evolving right now. And that's an interesting thing. Will there be more associated problems in the people who are living in the densely clustered apartment blocks around the light rail line than there are in the suburbs? These are questions that we need to think about. So well-being, also known as wellness, prudential value, quality of life, all those terms, it really refers to what's intrinsically valuable relative to somebody. In other words, it's a bit like the wilderness that I explained just now. What well-being is to me might not be what well-being is to you, but it is a very personal thing. And the well-being of a person is what is ultimately good for that person, what's in the self-interest of that person. In the UK, the Office of National Statistics, it defines well-being very specifically, and it says it has 12 broad dimensions. And it's the Office of National Statistics, like the Statistics Australia down the road. They spend all their time doing surveying people to try and get ideas on what kind of policies the government should be looking at. In this particular case, they were looking at what is the things that matter to people in the UK. And very interestingly, these 10 came through, and the top one is the natural environment. Then you go down: personal well-being, relationships, health, what we do, where we live, finance, economy, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see they're kind of grouped. And it's kind of interesting that a lot of these things come above education and skills. And health is reasonably up there, but health is then a part of well-being. It's not just equivalent to. Well-being is much, much broader than health. And as I say, the natural environment coming out at top. But as we'll explore in a moment, what does that mean? What is the natural environment? WHO, the body that brought you COVID, is in 2006, they talked about this interesting fact that approximately 1/4 of the global disease burden, more than 1/3 among children, is due to factors that can be modified. We can change things, not with great deal of difficulty. And this is a standard Asian city. It just happens to be in southern China, where there is green, but you can see the cluster of buildings, and you can see very clearly, it's not just poor photography, the haze that surrounds these buildings and the cities generally in most of East Asia, indeed most of Southeast Asia. And on bad days, even Sydney and Melbourne. So they went on to say, acting together on the basis of coordinated health, environment, and development policies, we can make a real difference to human well-being. But note that it's not just health here, it's how do we coordinate the policies in health, environment, and development. And this is something we really have to keep much more focus on. We've spent most of last century looking at things in deep silos. And there's value in that, and there's importance in that. But unless we break down those silos and start bringing some of these ideas across, we're not going to make progress. These guys here are part of a land care effort in Western Australia. And it's a good example there of where they're looking to undertake environmental restoration, but at the same time working with the local Noongar people to allow them to return to lands from which they've essentially been dispossessed, to carry out cultural activities, cultural renewal, as they call it. So there's a whole lot of ways in which, quite simply, we can make significant changes. Across the Dutch land care research in New Zealand, did some really interesting work on this, I think. They have this schema here. Nature is defined by a particular state. They go on to say that supplies of materials, processes, and cognitive experiences that contribute to well-being. People receive benefits from the contributions, and those benefits add to one or more dimensions of well-being. And they say nature provides many benefits. Well, we know that. Some of them are easy to see or put a monetary value on. This is our instrumental values. Some benefits we know of, but we can't see, partly the intrinsic. And then again, some benefits are personal and subjective, like the Pohutakawa flower, which does look nice, except it's rather kind of sort of poor quality eucalypt, really, or buried holly. That's UK. Sorry, I have to put some UK stuff in. So these are the relational aspects. And making sure that we're balancing instrumental, intrinsic, and relational is really critical. They have a table which shows things which are much more familiar. This is in a sense looking also at what we call ecosystem services. From nature to well-being, good soil organic matter, leads to direct and tangible value of food and fiber. Healthy functioning wetland, as an example, goes through reduction and regulation of flooding. Well, that's something that's topical. And then into community safety. Wouldn't it have been good if wetland systems in and around Lismore had been more functional? And then the state, this idea of something that we're really appreciating, like the vibrant Pohutakawa, its beauty, and then the subjective well-being, the goodness we feel as a result of that. And this is really interesting because this also translates into what's been written about since the 90s under the title Ecosystem Services. And right now in Geneva, there's a huge argument in the meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity, where some countries are saying, we don't like this ecosystem services because it's really only pointing towards instrumental values. It's not incorporating the other values, and we'd like it replaced by other language. And unfortunately, it's unfortunate or not, most countries are saying, no, ecosystem services, our decision makers and our politicians understand ecosystem services, brackets we think, therefore we don't really want to introduce yet another term to further confuse them. And so there is this delicate balance of how we deal with something that is definitely well understood in the scientific community, and I would say certainly in the policy community, with something that would appear to be more fuzzy. How does that actually work? Will that actually help? There's no answer to that. So our well-being, this is still Lancare research, their conclusions are well-being is deeply dependent on our relationship with nature. Some of these relationships are visible and tangible, others we may not always understand, appreciate, or acknowledge. And here we come into the other term that is becoming popular in some courses, nature's contributions to people, which kind of wraps up ecosystem services, but doesn't necessarily wrap it all up. And nature's contributions to people are really just that. What contributions come from nature, both positive and negative? So a biting mosquito with the latest virus to invade us is a contribution from nature. It's not one we want, but it's a contribution. It's supposed also to include the idea of people's contributions to nature. Again, in my opening remark about how the Ngunnawal people have basically created the landscape in which we sit, that's not really incorporated in that. And some are desperately saying, yes, it does, but actually it doesn't really. And we need to think clearly before we replace ecosystem services with a rather vague comment like that. Is it just because it's trendy, or is it really going to serve a purpose? The IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, it defined nature's contributions to people. And this was the problem. This was not a concept that came out of research, thought, discussion, etc. It came out of frenzied work on an assessment of the global state of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And so they counted, as I say, they came up in this process with that it's positive and negative, that it's of living nature, in other words, the diversity of genes, species, ecosystems, all the processes that go with them to the quality of life or well-being. And the important point was that it was positive and negative. But of course, the definition really is that it's mostly positive. So it's people-focused, and that's part of the problem, because it implies this one-way relationship which may or may not resonate with being at one with nature or principles of reciprocity as common in Indigenous peoples and local community perspectives, and what I call the hegemony of protection. So we like, as a urban society in Australia, in the US, Canada, we like the idea of protected areas, national parks, aren't they great? Well, they've been around for 100 years and the success rate is actually not that good. Some of the poster children of national parks like Yellowstone is a disaster. Now it's becoming to be realized because the Indians, the Amerindians who were in that area were just shifted out because it's a national parks, wilderness area. We don't want people there. And so, missing the point, same problem here with when we talk about fire. We don't think about what the fire practices were before we arrived on the scene. And so a related challenge is this relational and intrinsic values that people place on nature are subjective, and it makes it difficult to really see, particularly in an increasing multicultural society, how do we have these conversations? So this is a picture of I'm on the Isle of Man, which is a tiny little island in the Irish Sea. It's very nice. And I was engaged in a tree planting ceremony, and this guy was there too. It turns out he's an Indian. He spent most of his life in big cities, Calcutta, Delhi, and now apparently he's living in Dubai. He doesn't really have any kind of appreciation of this. For me, this is paradise, perfect, open space, nice, lovely area. He's nervous that, where are the skyscrapers? Where can I go? And so we need to recognize that. That's just as valid a viewpoint. But how do we cater for that in the developing world? But it also means that people can have different opinions on the importance of nature for themselves, including the scale at which they experience and they value and benefit from nature. So what do people benefit from a koala? Birch or ash or eucalypt trees, a river, catchment, park or reserve. Each of these is different and we receive them in different ways. This guy I took the picture of this guy in French Island quite a number of years ago. I won't say how many because it's embarrassing, but he won't be a recipient of ScoMo's 50 million giveaway. But then there's a related question to that. 50 million to save the koala. Is that a wise spend of 50 million? What else could we have done with that? Because what materially will it change? The billions that are being chucked towards the Great Barrier Reef. Will it actually change anything materially, or will it simply microscopically slow the degradation? These are really difficult questions for policymakers to grapple with, and certainly for politicians. But as practicing environmentalists, we need to be thinking about them much more. So what's wrong with this picture? I'll answer the question, don't worry, it's not a test. So you have this nice Bennett's wallaby sitting in the grass, very obediently waiting to be photographed. And my answer is nothing or everything. And why? Nothing. It's a marsupial mammal in a damp forest. It's what you'd expect to find in Tasmania. But everything, because it's not Tasmania, it's the Isle of Man. And the damp forest is a Ramsar site. And this particular issue is exactly the problem, because on the island, there are two quite distinct groups. One, the Manx Wildlife Trust, that's in horror that there are escaped wallabies in a Ramsar site. How can this be? The other are the tourism side, because it's known, it's an attractive destination for tourists to come and hope to catch a picture of the wallaby. So this is really a very good example of this value question. It's the values. Do I value the wallaby because it's in an unusual situation? Do I value it because I can take a picture of it? Or do I look in horror at it because it's actually damaging the wetland site? Frankly, it's damaging it less than the management practices, but that's another issue. So, rethinking our relationship with nature is critical to wilding the body and the mind. And here we come against the clash of natural versus managed, native versus weedy, and the future of the biosphere. These three things. Tim, I hope you can see. Oh, how do we get rid of this? No. Okay. Well, it doesn't matter. I can tell you what it says. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Let's not go into a side discussion. It's the importance of 1500 or 1788 is the heading. And what that means is that in UK law, in fact, if a plant species, or indeed an animal species, is introduced before 1500, it's regarded as an archaeophyte, not necessarily a native, but an archaeophyte. And if it's introduced after 1500, it's a neophyte. With us, here in this country, after 1788, it's mayhem, of course, and before, apparently nothing. But what about the dingo? What about the tamarind trees, the trade with the macassars brought over to the Northern Territory, the shores of the Northern Territory? There are lots of things here that predate European arrival. And so this simple dichotomy of before 1500 or after 1500 raises all sorts of issues. And the fact is that the European landscapes, particularly, it's not so much our case, but in Europe, the landscapes are still resorting after the last ice age. So it makes no sense to say, 1500 is after 1500, we should regard them as weeds and we should try and get rid of them. Because, the Romans occupied Britain for quite a while, and they brought a whole lot of stuff because they couldn't find anything to eat except turnips and radishes. So they brought a whole lot of food plants from the Mediterranean, which are now, according to that definition, essentially natives. And so we are increasingly seeing this issue of ecofusion, where these kind of plants and animals and natives are blending or recombining to form essentially novel ecosystems. And I know this is an uncomfortable concept, and a lot of ecologists really don't like it, particularly restoration ecologists, because they want to go back. They don't like the thought that they've got to meddle with something new. But it is something we need to think about in this context. It's nature. And if what we need as a species is more nature, then we need to manage it in an appropriate way. So in this idea, here's a couple of shots from the UK. This is a fairly grotty and fairly standard stream. It's actually in the middle of Sheffield, which used to be one of the most polluted cities in the UK. But here you have one plant species anemone, and this one is wild garlic next to it. Both of these are indicators of ancient woodland. So you have this complete confusion. Here you are in the middle of an urban area, population about a little bit more than Canberra. And yet there's clearly signs of it being an ancient woodland, and these species are surviving. Another thing in the area that I was able to discover was a dry ski slope, which collapsed in about 80 years ago. But the birch trees find it perfect because these lattices are ideal places for seeds to germinate, and given the right conditions, i.e. plenty of rain, which there is, they're off. So it's almost a kind of free-form garden that's being created there. And in time, all that will be just buried. So if we look at what the landscape architect's view on all of this is, very famous architect, a very formidable lady, Dame Sylvia Crowe, was landscape architect for the Forestry Commission, UK Forestry Commission for many years, had this to say: functional spaces must look right in any given landscape. Landscaping is often what you leave out, not what you put in. You need absolute simplicity to knit the landscape back. Again, I emphasize those last points: knit the landscape back again. That's kind of restoration, but it's not what ecological restoration necessarily means. So is wilding in the mind and the Anthropocene, does it matter from where the species come? Should it matter? Should we really think about it? And is nature conservation about to become natural design? So if we think about the inner transformation, if you like, that we have to make in our own mindsets, it relates to all these different aspects of our existence: mindsets, values, worldviews, beliefs, spirituality, human nature connectedness, biocultural diversity. This is probably the most important. And then looking back at that ecosystem services debate, it's a debate we'll have to have. A lot of people don't necessarily want it, or will try and dig in, but it's a debate we have to have. And getting the nexus right between all these things will help the system change towards better sustainability. If we're better in our minds, if we're more relaxed in our minds, we can be more sustainable. So to finish, there are 8 points that I think are important for us to think about: subjective well-being and physical health, self-reflection and awareness, activation of intrinsic, non-materialistic core values in ourselves, pro-environmental and pro-social attitudes, consumer choices, social activism, and so on, sense of interconnectedness, compassion, equity, and social justice. It's not easy to be all of that, but some of that does help. And then the last 3 of the 8, deliberate, flexible, adaptive attitudes, for example, to climate change, biodiversity change, conflict resolution. We have to be adaptive. Climate's not going to stop changing. Even if we do all the things we know we should do tomorrow, the climate's already got enough baked in it to be continuing to change. We have to adapt. The trouble is, if you promote that, then governments say, oh, then maybe we don't need to mitigate. So it's a very difficult balance and argument to make. Human nature connectedness, so critical. And then sustainably oriented social learning and innovation. That is, what's the integration of the different ways of knowing? How can we bring together Western science, Indigenous knowledge, side by side? Not integrate, not blend, but see what each is telling us and try and get some interesting ideas and insights from that. And they're the points where I think, as environmental educators, we have the most opportunity to influence and help the rest of society, and indeed ourselves, get out of the anxiety that apparently we're in. So finally, remember again those words of the gentleman of the cabbie. It's like medicine. Medicine for the mind, the soul, the ultimate eco-cure for eco-anxiety, maybe even COVID. And before I finish, has anyone noticed that the University of Canberra logo has an eerie resemblance? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I guess we have time for some questions. I don't know what time it is, but yeah, please. Any questions? And for the guys out there, please use the chat if you have any questions.
There's one chat already. Do we need to do that?
There's one comment. Yep. Ross?
Peter, thanks for that. It's really interesting. Every time I go to Europe, and I've been working with groups in Europe on this sort of issue, I'm struck by how sophisticated the thinking is around this. Who's providing that thought leadership in Australia? Because I don't see Australia really as a player in this kind of thing.
No, unfortunately, it's not. And that's a great pity, because the potential here is enormous, because we have, we are living amongst an Indigenous civilization that could really help in this dialogue that we need to have. The dialogue is easy to postulate in Europe, but it's much more difficult to have because the Picts, the Scots have all been vanquished. And, you know, there really are no Indigenous people left in Britain or in, well, there are in some parts of Spain, there are some interesting enclaves where you can get close, but it's not the same thing. So I think it's led, it's not really led in Europe from that viewpoint. It's from much more theoretical viewpoint, but also Europeans do travel. So they've been in other places in Africa, Latin America, North America, even here. And so they pick up on some of these vibes and then take it back and have the opportunity to think about it. I think part of the problem in Australia is that there are so many things that actually confront us that we don't take the time to just step back and think more about these things. We do. It is something where you do need to do a lot more thinking and talking about because it's not something you can sit down, do a quick lab experiment and write a paper. It's got to be a conversation. But I think we're at a very interesting point in the relationship between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians. It may not seem that way, but when I think of what the situation was like when I arrived in Australia, which wasn't that long after Aboriginal people had actually formally been recognised as people. I mean, it sounds grotesque, but that's the reality. It was. I think the thing that it's changed so much. And we're able to have these conversations now and think about it. There's still a lot of totemism, but I think we're getting to a place where we are beginning to have these kind of really interesting discussions. And so we've got the opportunity within this country to bring across those Indigenous ideas and values, but we're also got an incredibly multicultural society now. I mean, when I arrived in Australia, Australia proclaimed itself to be multicultural, which meant that there were several different kinds of Europeans here. And maybe some Aborigines, but you didn't see them because they were either on the edge of the city or in the bush. So that's also changed incredibly. And so we've got that dynamic as well. And as I tried to show in that one slide, there's, you know, two people who might apparently share a common view, common habitat, actually very different in how they're thinking, reacting, and what their needs are. And we're not planning for any of that. We're not thinking about that. There are some, what do I do with these things here?
We scroll back. I'm not sure what that was about. I'm not sure even who said that. Comment more than a question.
That's Peter Unmack saying, agree with many aspects of the talk. Clearly, we need to change our approach to conservation in the light of climate change and its related major impacts. We need to move away from being risk averse. When fisheries managers ask me where I can stock a particular fish, it's a conservation concern. I respond, they're all stuffed. So in the larger picture, it doesn't really matter. They all have a laugh and seem to agree, but I don't think they fully get it. It's a message that needs to be more broadly considered and communicated. Not that everything is stuffed per se, but that we need to change our thinking about managing natural landscapes and the biota. Yeah, I agree. That's really a very good observation. And it's, I mean, I go back to the koala thing. It's great that it's 50 million available for koalas, but will it really make a significant difference? And could or should we be spending that money in a different way if there's that money available? What else could we do with it that might be more urgent? And in fact, if the Australian population is very concerned about keeping the koala, sounds horrible, but I'll keep on going, then maybe we have to think of different ways of doing it. For example, there are koalas in Western Australia in Yanchep National Park, which is not a national park, it's kind of a zoo. Is that what we are looking at? Maybe we are. And then again, we need to go back and question it's a very Western view that the koala should be kept intact in a bushland setting that's already degraded. So, you know, where do we go from there? It's very complicated. There's another thing. I thought the comment about different Canberra housing zones are different. I think that's how you convince citizens to stop thinking about wilderness as a monolith. Okay, good. Thanks, Sal. And Ben Kefford, is the 50 million so that the government looks like it's doing something? Well, yes, Ben.
Quite a bit of a thought bubble, but I think we've always talked about rolling paper, which is called as science being used as an excuse to not do anything. And it is, if you were to spend $50 million on saving koalas, you wouldn't do science. You'd go out and you'd buy $50 million worth of land and solve clear. And so I guess the risk is we're almost complicit in some of this because we're being funded to investigate things as they decline, when that same funding could actually be immediately applied to solving some of these issues.
Yeah, and that's, so if you take that comment to the barrier reef, huge amount of money being spent on the barrier reef to look at genetic variants that will stand hotter water and so on. It's the symptom, it's not the problem. And so, yeah, we're very good at thinking through and doing stuff and saying, okay, we can cure this. It's like medicine in general, you know. I mean, the health system, in the UK, the National Health Service, which is a very good service, is actually a national illness service because there's no promotion of health. If there was, there would be half the weight of humanity in England that there currently is. And so that's another issue that we have. Health is something that should be promoted as health, not the opposite to illness. Illness is something that you may or you may not get, and a lot of illness is accidental. It's partly genes, it's partly if you're in the way of a virus or whatever, and we don't think of it in those terms. We just think of it, oh, you know, that's you know, we can reach down and get the latest pill and give you, or send you off for a blood test or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'd accept that science is just an excuse for doing nothing, but in a way you can argue that point, that just by doing more science, it's like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. You're running on the spot all the time, but you're not moving forward, spending a lot of energy. But that won't win any votes, of course. If you say that the koala, you can do it by just, but the problem is 50 million won't buy much land, not where the koala is. I mean, there are other ways of thinking about and dealing with the koala as a particular species, but it's because it's emblematic. And that's another thing, you know, why do we get so worried about particular species? Because they're emblematic. If we keep the koalas and bushfires increasing, are we in fact increasing the stress on that particular creature? Is that the best way to deal with it? I mean, these are not easy questions, and they're not exam questions, and they're not questions that we normally think about. But yeah, I think they should be. We do need to think in different ways, and we do need to reach across between disciplines much more. I mean, I just wish that I'd done more of that when I was younger, when I could think straight. But the opportunity is in this room to actually make these kind of changes, or not. It's your choice.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
There's
Yes.
another question before I jump to you. Okay, I've got a question. You basically nicely said, okay, we have all different values. And basically, every time I meet someone in terms of conservation concept, think about that, I have to, in the ideal sense, deconstruct myself before the other ones and tell them, okay, these are my values. That's how I come up with these ideas, because they're based on this kind of assumption. And the other one has to do the same. And that's almost impossible. It's a too long process. Do you have any recommendation how you do that, or any tips how you approach if you meet someone and like from a different culture, different settings, different stakeholder? Is there any shortcut for that process?
I think the answer is that you don't try and deconstruct yourself. But you need to have in mind that they may well be operating on I mean, we normally assume that if we're going to talk one-to-one with somebody, that they share our values. That's the kind of initial thing. We don't necessarily think about. I mean, maybe if there's someone that's speaking a different language and has a different skin color, we might feel that they might have some different values. And then we might be surprised to discover they've actually got the same values. So, you know, the outward signals that we get do not necessarily reflect what's happening inside. It's just being more aware of these things. And I think it's part of the conversation that is beginning. It's still slow, but it is definitely beginning between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. And we can't say Europeans anymore because of this multiculturalism. It's, you know, there's a whole set of different people. So the Indigenous Australians are now having to, if they want to have a conversation, they have a conversation with someone of Caucasian origins, an Indian, someone from Iran, wherever, you know, it's a much more complicated picture. And Australia is very much the world in microcosm, which goes back to Ross's point that why aren't we doing more here? Why doesn't Australia do more? Because it's an ideal melting pot for this kind of thing.
Okay, I guess we are at the end of time. I checked the time by looking at the chat. I think the last time was 15 minutes ago. Okay, thanks a lot for everyone, and thanks a lot to Peter, and put your hands together. And yeah, thank you.